copies of the slide, the PowerPoint?
Welcome, friends.
If we are.
I just want to appreciate all of the work that has been going on these last several days. Work we've done together in this room, work I've heard in conversations through all parts of this campus, work that I know today we brought into our bodies with Amanda's workshop this morning, into our stories. And as we've been exploring liberation theology within and without, I just want to thank you all for the work of integrating that within and without effort. And it's part of why I'm so excited to welcome Reverend Renee McKenzie Hayward to join us tonight, because I think she does the work within and without. She was born and raised in Chester, so we got to hear about Chester in Raj's talk this morning. She's attended Chester Public Schools. I could say a lot about her, but we're talking about put downs and put ups, and how put ups can also do some harm. So I'm trying to not be too much of a fangirl, even though I really want to. But one thing I do want to share is that on Wednesday of this week, we opened our whole time together hearing from Carmela Apollonia Hernandez, zooming in, videoing in to talk about her experience in Sanctuary. And she's in Sanctuary at Church of the Advocate, Reverend Renee's church, and where she has been since 2011. But also on Wednesday of this week, Carmela just took such bold leadership, leaving Sanctuary with Reverend Renee and her daughter Carrie and a number of other support people, and went to Senator Casey's office, our Democratic senator here in Pennsylvania, and demanded he provide evidence of his work to provide her sanctuary, that he answer her leadership and take leadership to protect her family and her children. And Reverend Renee, as I said, was part of that action. And I just think that type of bold living of values, challenging our structures, but also challenging ourselves, is all about what we've been working on these last couple of days, and all about liberation theology. So I'm very excited to welcome Reverend Renee McKenzie Hayward.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored by the invitation. I'm going to talk mostly about the Church of the Advocate and the work that we're doing, because I think that that's the story. Right? So I arrived at the Church of the Advocate in 2011, prepared and yet still very much unprepared. I had 10 years of ministry behind me as an Episcopal priest. 2 years I was an associate in Haddonfield, and then for the 8 previous years of my coming to the Advocate, I was director of a congregation in West Philadelphia. I had received my PhD with a concentration in womanist religious thought and the philosophy of religion. I came with those tools ready for ministry at the Advocate. But with my first visit to the sanctuary, and this is before I even was formally on board, I visited the sanctuary of the Advocate. And I sat there, and I realized that there was an intensity to this place, the likes of which I had never experienced before. I saw it when I saw all the murals generally, but I saw it in particular when I saw this mural. This mural is one of the 14 murals we have located around the nave of our 152-year-old nationally landmark French Gothic Revival-style cathedral. North Philadelphia is a place where activism and numbness coexist side by side at almost every turn. The murals were commissioned by Father Paul Washington and painted in place by two artists, Walter Edmonds and or Richard Watson. They vividly tell the story of the African American experience of oppression and resistance to oppression. And they tell this story in an unflinching manner, as you can see from that mural. And it tells the story with large print and with great detail. Anyone who comes into this space, anyone who comes into the sanctuary must contend with these murals. And these murals were painted between 1973 and 1976. And when I saw that mural, I was struck. And one of the questions that I had to sit with for a minute was, how can something so violent be present in the church if the church is a place of peace? And for a while I was struck with that dichotomy. And then it occurred to me over the months of sitting with this mural and thinking about these murals, and it became painfully clear to me that if the church cannot tell the truth about what's going on in people's lives, and I don't know where we're going to hear the truth. So I learned something about the intensity of the advocate based upon its willingness to tell this uncomfortable truth. During his 22 years of leadership, Father Paul Washington shaped the Church of the Advocate. He shaped it into a place of radical welcome and a place that offered radical socio-political religious critique. This place challenged the social convention of any predefined winners and losers. It challenged the system of white supremacy. It challenged the second-class status of women. It challenged church business as usual and fostered a community of artists and arts organizations who understood the role of culture in creating community, in sharing meaning and raising consciousness. This is the Church of the Advocate. This happened at the Church of the Advocate in large and small ways. Our building itself is naturally landmarked not only for the extraordinary architect that you see before you, but it's also naturally landmarked because of the events that took place inside that sanctuary. It became nationally known as the Center for Civil Rights in Philadelphia, Center for the Black Power movement in the city. In 1968, the Advocate hosted a Black Power conference of 8,000 people from across the country, people who were resolute in a mission to harness the power of growing Black consciousness in America and to organize the Black community for self-determination. Again, in 1970, the church hosted another large national event, this time a meeting of the Revolutionary People's Constitutional Convention of the Black Panther Party at the Church of the Advocate. And in 1974, the Advocate again hosted a national event. And this time it was the irregular ordination of the first 11 women to the Episcopal priesthood. An ordination that was only approved by the church 2 years after the ordination. Each of these three major events were pivotal. They were important and they were controversial. But it was the ordination of the women of the Philadelphia 11, it's called, that posed the greatest threat to Paul's ministry and to the ministry of the Church of the Advocate. It is one thing to scoff at social convention, but to directly disobey church hierarchy can be a much more greater threat, especially if you're financially dependent upon the larger church to pay your bills. Paul had been directly forbidden by his bishop to either participate in this ordination of the 11 or especially not to host it at the Advocate. To ignore this admonition could threaten Paul's ministry and the ministry of the congregation, because the Advocate was and remains a mission congregation of the Diocese of Pennsylvania. And to be a mission congregation simply means that the church itself cannot come up with enough money to pay its rector. And so the diocese contributes, the diocese pays my salary, so technically I am on the bishop's staff, just the way Paul was on the bishop's staff during his time. But Paul and the congregation elected to fly in the face of almost certain disciplinary actions because of the call of the Spirit was that much greater upon his life. The people who chose to participate in this ordination, they were simply following the lead of the Holy Spirit. And this is how Paul describes the necessity of the moment in his welcome address to those who were gathered for the ordination. He says, "Our actions today are untimely, but the dilemma is, what is one to do when the democratic process, the political dynamics, and the legal guidelines are out of step with the imperative which says, now is the time." That was the question that shaped Paul's ministry. In the same way, this question pushes liberation theologians today. What are we to do when the Spirit of God, when the Spirit of goodness and the Spirit of righteousness, when the Spirit of justice commands a response from us that will place us at odds with the social, political, religious culture of our time, the present moment? Because it is in this moment in which God is calling us to love and to do justice now. Untimely actions are at the core of resistance activities. We know that there is never the right time to challenge assumptions, never the right time to collapse hierarchies, or never the right time to take a sharp pivot for the truth. It is up to us to create or usher in the moment of change by living boldly and responding boldly when the demand for justice overwhelms us and demands an affirmative response. My ministry at the Advocate began 25 years after Paul Washington's retirement. And after 20 more late years of following the ministry of his immediate successor, Reverend Isaac Miller. Still, the relevance of Paul's ministry persists, and not just from a historical perspective. It is not that Paul happened upon a unique formula for inspiring work within a community. This is less a statement about the durability of a winning formula, as much as it is a statement about the fierceness of resistance to and the slow nature of social change. 50 years after the March on Washington, 50 years after the Black Power Conference, we find ourselves in a remarkably similar place with remarkably familiar challenges to living, being Black in America. Theology at the Advocate is best understood as having a bottom-up orientation rather than a top-down one. God in this view does not sit high and look low. God is here now, with us now, in the immediacy of this moment. God is present. We recognize the immediate presence of God in and among us. God is in the everydayness of our lives and not a part of it, not apart from it. God is a fellow traveler in the muck and the mire of existence who calls us, who gives us energy, who pulls us forward. And even as we yearn for more of the presence of God, God calls us to look at and to love the other person. We are always already in a relationship with the other. I suppose you could say that my liberation theology has a little bit of Jewish influence, because Emmanuel Levinas, a French Jewish philosopher who experienced the horrors of World War II in the Jewish work camp, writes that we are always already in relationship with others. He says that before the moment of conscious awareness, our innate desire for God is deflected by God towards the other person in the form of subjectivity and responsibility. Before we can consciously choose to or not, we are drawn towards the other person. As much as we love God, God calls us to love the other. God calls us to relationship. Our love of God, our desire for God, our relationship with God becomes relationship with the other person. Always, already. But in our conscious reality, though, we have a choice. We can choose to continue radical love for the other, or we can choose not to love them. The choice of the Advocate historically has been to choose to radically love other people. The power and the potential of a place like the Church of the Advocate resides in the strength of relationships. First and foremost being the strength of the relationship with the divine presence. The Advocate ministry of forging and growing relationships is active 7 days a week this year. Monday through Saturday, we touch over 500 unique people, adults and children, and most of these people come to the Advocate 4 or 5 times per week. As busy as we are on weekdays, the central importance of the Sunday worshiping community remains. Our small worshiping congregation is of critical importance because this witness, our prayers, our presence, ground all the work that we do. The spiritual grounding gives ultimate meaning to the social services we provide and our community-centered approach to being. The worshiping community. 50 years after the March on Washington, the Black community remains a community under siege. Our resiliency is being strained, but it has not broken. The cost we are paying for living years in a hostile environment is high, and as we look into our community, we face the impact of lives fed on a steady diet of trauma. Recently, our parish leadership team began to ask ourselves some questions. What does it mean for a faith-based institution to care for individuals and communities impacted by years, centuries of systemic trauma? How would a trauma-informed approach add to our understanding of how we have been primed to become who we have become as individuals and as a community? What positive, holistic value would a trauma-informed approach add to our ministry? These are the questions that we began to struggle with. With the 2017 proposal to develop a trauma-informed ministry at the Advocate, I was selected as an Episcopal Church Foundation Fellow, and we were given funds to begin exploration of the impact of trauma upon our lives, and to create a program that would offer ourselves and will offer others an environment that would foster relationships and promote healing. A small group began to meet on a regular basis to delve into this topic, intending to create a program that would be transformational for our church and for the larger community. Our steering committee for the project was a group of 8 women whose professional lives were dedicated to addressing and healing trauma or dedicated to academic research. Our vision was to develop a research-based program focused on healing that could be replicable in part for other faith-based organizations also working in an urban context. Represented on this team were members of my congregation who were and mental health and social work professionals from the community who were attached to the Advocate in some way. And we developed a program that we called the North Philadelphia Community Healing Project that is focused on correctly naming the systemic oppression and helping ourselves to heal and to be strengthened for the fight for community health and individual wellness. Ultimately, the real power of the Advocate in places like it resides in our capacity to hold space and to foster relationships. One thing we know for certain is that only safe, supportive spaces allow for the possibility of human healing for traumatized people. In traumatogenic environments, communities like North Philadelphia, safe, supportive relationships are essential. Sandy Bloom, who you may know, who was one of the leading researchers on trauma-informed care, she writes in her book, Bearing Witness, Violence and Collective Responsibility, and she defines a traumatogenic environment as one in which human beings are at increased risk for experiencing traumatic events. She writes, there are many traumatogenic forces in our society, including child-rearing practices that encourage the use of violence directed at children or that impair the ability of parents to adequately provide for their children, poverty, sexism, racism, male conditioning to use violence as a means of control, and many other kinds of social stresses, all of which are embedded within a religious and philosophical belief system that permits and even encourages the use of violence. The church needs to seriously consider what we can do about the trauma that our people are facing. And so we started this program, the North Philadelphia Community Healing Project. And so these slides that you're going to see, these images, these are all of the murals. These are all of the murals that are in. There are some of the murals that are in the Church of the Advocate. So we asked the question, what calls us to a trauma-informed ministry? In part, I want to respond, what calls us to a trauma-informed ministry are our ancestors. People who have struggled, who have fought the fight before us and continue to fight, who have laid down for us the pattern of what it means to resist and struggle for change. Recently, I was talking to a documentarist, and he was asking me, well, what is it like to preach in front of these murals all the time? The murals hold me accountable. When I stand there Sunday after Sunday and I see these images, and I know these images represent real people who have struggled, who have fought, who have laid down all that they had, that they say, Renee, you can't sit there and bullshit people. The price we paid was too high. And so it is the ancestors who call us. The other thing I want to point out, I think the Church of the Advocate is probably the only place where you're going to see Elijah Muhammad. Right? Malcolm X. Right? Because this is not about religion for us, right? It's not just about religion. Our community is the nucleus, is the heart of what it is we do, but what we do is for the community, and it makes no difference who you are, what your background is. We share, some of us, a lot of us share that moment of oppression. So what calls us to do trauma-informed ministry? So there is this thing called the Asa Study, and some of you are probably familiar with it because I see that there are a lot of people here who talk about trauma and know about it. And so you know that original study was done in 1998, and ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so what they discovered was that there was a direct correlation between the number of your score on your ACE study. There are 10 possibilities. The higher the score, the greater your chances are that you have some type of trauma that's active in your life. Trauma is sometimes called the most significant public health survey that no one has ever heard of, this ACE study. Due to the time it took to reach public awareness, the study was done in 1998 by the CDC as well as Kaiser Permanente. And they asked 10 questions about childhood household experiences that demonstrated a link to adult health and well-being. These 10 questions were called the ACEs study. And they range from questions about your parents' mental illness, to sexual abuse, to witnessing domestic violence. The study results were shocking and groundbreaking. But the first ACEs studied white people living in middle America. White, middle-class, college-educated group of people. The findings, however, and who could not be surprised, did not adequately represent people who lived in an urban environment. It did not consider the reality of people of color, people who had to live and move and have their being in the urban context. So a Philadelphia survey was taken in 2012, and it was a Philadelphia ACEs study. And the Philadelphia ACEs study added five more categories of level of community stressors, in addition to the household stressors that we saw in the first ACEs study. But the second study spoke directly to the challenges to people living in urban Philadelphia, but it has become a model for understanding similar communities across the country. In Philadelphia, where roughly a quarter of the residents live in poverty, the community level indicators include witnessing violence, living in foster care, bullying, experiencing racism or discrimination, and feeling unsafe in your neighborhood. That's an urban context. Researchers found that almost 40% of Philadelphians had experienced four or more community level ACE scores, of a score of 4 or more, which demonstrate a high level of individual trauma yielding poor outcomes in an urban context. So our approach. So I read Cedric Johnson's Race, Religion, and Resilience far after we developed the approach, but this really speaks to what our approach is. Strategies of care erroneously tend to focus only on managing symptoms and controlling individual behavior with no consideration given to changing the oppressive structures, practices, and discourses that adversely impact human behavior. Which means that if you really want to affect change, it's not about changing the individual lives, it's about changing the system. And if you're serious about doing trauma work, how we understand it, then you have to be serious about trying to change the system. And so that's why we define in our mission statement what we're out to combat, to challenge, is a system of white supremacy. I should have Camille up here talking about this. She's much more knowledgeable than I am. But there's systemic trauma has a literal effect on the brain. I mean, our life, we are actually changed by the trauma that we experience. And we see there on the right hand, that's a healthy brain of a child. Well, on the left, that's a child that has faced trauma. And you see that there are changes. And there are also changes in DNA as well for people who have to live under the force of systemic trauma multiple generations, year after year. So the structural impact of white supremacy on black lives, well, we know it causes inadequate access to health care, suicide and depression, self-hatred, poverty, substance abuse, unemployment, incarceration, homelessness. You will not really get to change those things if you just are trying to fix people on an individual level. Because it is the system that is somehow managing all of this that needs to be challenged. I think most of us will be probably familiar with this white colored waterfall. And at some point we consider that to be normative. But what was happening, people were paying a high price for this kind of segregation. What will it mean then for a faith-based community, faith-based institution to care for individuals and communities impacted by systemic trauma? That was the question that we had to struggle with. And so we came up, we discovered this verse and said, okay, this will be our theological statement of how we understand what we're doing. And it comes from Isaiah. For I am about to create new heavens and a new earth. The former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in what I am creating. For I am about to create Jerusalem as a joy and its people as a delight.
Yes.
There's a reliance on God because we know that God has already called this freedom, this liberation into being. We just need to live into it. And we're trying to do that. So our trauma-informed healing center, we're creating a culture of healing focused on the needs of the advocate community that weave together a program of activities and resources to create welcoming space, offering pathways to individual and community healing components. Basically what I'm saying is that, there are some programs that are already taking place at the Advocate that we just needed to pull them under one intentional umbrella and say, we're going to use this as a way that we're going to help the community deal with trauma. So we said these are the components. We're talking about individual healing. You really want to be able to reach people on the spiritual, emotional, intellectual, physical, social, environmental, and financial level. So when I thought about the Advocate, I said, okay, that's probably a little bit too much for when we go out the gate for our healing project. And so we picked areas that we were already providing services for and services to the community. So we talk about addressing the physical component. What is going on at the Advocate now that helps to address the physical component of the need to heal? And the question for that is where we live, work, and play. So the Advocate has a soup kitchen, I mentioned that. But we serve a meal to about 120 people per day, 5 days a week. And we've been doing that for 35 years. That was one of the programs that Father Paul Washington started. But it's still going strong. We have clothing giveaway. That's our gymnasium. So we have athletic possibilities. We can offer that kind of physical healing. And of course, that's our cook menu. But this mural here, this is one of my favorite murals, by the way. because this is the only mural of the 14 that's dedicated to women. And so we see women in different states here, in different states of undress, losing their crown or perhaps gaining their crown as a queen, but it also talks to the reality that women do not have control over their own bodies. And then to make matters even worse, our black men were robbed of the possibility of offering us protection. When we accept that to be the cultural norm, that men will protect their wives and their women. So somewhere in that mural, there's an upside-down man. And you may need to come to the Advocate to see the mural first, but that'll give you a good reason to come and check out the murals. How do we address the mental and intellectual component already at the Advocate? How we live, work, and play. Well, there's a group that comes to the Advocate every Saturday called the Saturday Free School. And they come and they have high levels of conversation about philosophy, but these high levels of conversation are engaged by people who are off the street who may or may not be literate, but who has a strong sense of right and wrong and who want to be able to hear these things. And it's a rich conversation, but it represents the community. We give away books, just normal things. I mean, and that's part of what we're saying in this trauma healing approach, right? Is that there's nothing really special about the things that we're offering. A lot of churches, a lot of faith-based organizations are already doing these things. We're simply saying, let's pull it under one umbrella and be intentional about naming the trauma and creating an environment where people can heal. People can only heal from trauma if it is a genuinely safe space. I wish you could see this mural as well. This is a powerful mural. It talks about the different levels of oppression. On the bottom level, you can't really make it out, but you see the kinds of things that hold us down are sexual indiscretions, drugs, alcohol, belief in demons. All of these things weigh us down on an individual level, right? But they're saying that on a systemic level, the things above are also the things that keep us enchained, and that's corporate America, that's business, that's religion. And then you see these eyes right here. I don't have the pointer. Yeah. So this mural is painted by Walter Edmonds, and he's the one who does all the really fiery, colorful ones. But all of his murals have the eyes of the oppressor. Right? So what happens as you go through the murals and you start approaching a time of relative liberation by the time you get to the 14th mural, but the eyes of the oppressor are always there. Right? Because we understand on some visceral level that systemic white supremacy is going to be a force that will always be with us. Right? We need to be strong. Our community needs to be healed. So how do we address the emotional component? Why we live, work, and play? Well, we have drum circles so people can express that, get a sense of that rhythm. We have educational tours where we teach people about what the story is of the murals, what it means for us today, and what it meant when they were painted, and we find that the story is the same. But we create an environment where it's okay for people to have difficult conversations. That's what the Advocate does. It's okay to have difficult conversations, and we will hold that space for those conversations. And of course, we celebrate. You have to celebrate. That's what gives us life. That's what gives us meaning. So addressing the spiritual component. So there are ways that we do that mind-body type of thing, like with yoga, mindfulness, Tai Chi. And then of course we have the Episcopal liturgy that happens on Sunday mornings. And then we have drum circles where we gather as a community. And of course at top right, we don't have a ring shout. That's what that represents. But what the placeholder for that ring shout is that we understand that as Black people, there are some traditional methods of spiritual worship that are unique to us and that gives us life and gives us meaning to our life. And so we want to hold a space for that. So the Advocate, right now we're in the process of beginning our Community Healing Project. We just had a tremendous open house this October the 6th, and it was absolutely incredible. And then we're moving into, for this semester, for the fall, yoga workshops. There'll be 8 workshops. And then we're going to have a workshop at the end in December that's going to talk about how to manage stress. So the idea is that we will have multiple classes going on so people can choose to go for something that's going to approach spiritual healing, something that's going to approach physical healing, emotional healing. People will find a place where they want to enter into the conversation. And we will always draw the connection to what is actually oppressing you. What is actually oppressing you? Because what happens for oppressed people, we internalize the oppression and we start to think that it's our fault. That it's about the choices that we have made. And that does have an impact, but the system preconditions you to make choices. It needs to be challenged. And the Advocate historically has been that place to offer the challenge. So this is the 14th mural. This is the final mural in our worship space. And I need to tell you that I look at this mural and I don't understand it one bit.
Growing process.
But it is said, it is called Martin Luther King's beloved community.
Oh.
That's what this is. According to King, and I read this, and where do we go from here, chaos or community, King writes, for hundreds of years, Negroes had fought to stay alive by developing an endurance to hardship and heartbreak. In this decade, and he was referring to the decade of the 60s, the Negro stepped into a new role. He no longer would endure, he would resist and win. He still had the age-old capacity to live in hunger and want, but now he banished these as his lifelong companions. He could tolerate humiliation and scorn, but now he armed himself with dignity and resistance, and his adversaries tasted the gall of defeat. The 1960s. Martin Luther King wrote this in '68, reflecting on the gains attributed to those who resisted and pressed and struggled during the civil rights period. We know that in this fight were people across, we knew who were in this fight, and that represented people across race, across ethnicity, and across religion, people who represented the whole people of God, people who were standing on the side of justice. That's Martin Luther King's beloved community. Then most people recognized the movement in terms of black and white. Today we recognize that the struggle for justice and human rights extends beyond the binaries of black and white to include all people of color and others who sit in the place of the marginalized and the oppressed. And that's Carmela and her family. November 2017, we welcomed this family into sanctuary at the Church of the Advocate. Carmela, her sons Felix, and Edwin, and her daughters Katie and Jocelyn. They still remain here 11 months later. This family fled violence in Mexico, but you know that because you spoke to Carmela. And they came here seeking asylum and safety. Their asylum claim was denied and deportation order was given to all of them while the appeal process made its way through the system. They could not go back during that time. For the Advocate not to offer them radical welcome when they needed it, for us not to provide sanctuary when we had the capacity to do so, would have been a betrayal of our faith, the faith that has been entrusted to us. To do that, to deny them, would be to foreclose on the possibility of Martin Luther King's beloved community. We understand that none is free until all are free. We still have work to do. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you. Questions?
feel like I just touched on a lot of things about the advocate, so you can ask me just about anything. If I can't answer, I'll let you know. Or reflect, what did you, let me just ask a question. Who has ever been to the Sanctuary of the Advocate and seen those tremendous spaces? Okay. All right. We do tours. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I have two questions and you can take your pick. One is, I wanted to hear also a bit about your story and your time with the Church of the Advocate. But I'm also very curious about what happened after Paul Washington defied those orders. And I mean, you said that 2 years later they were approved, so things resolved in a good way. But
no, it was scary for a while because Paul did receive a call from the bishop a couple of days after the ordination. He was told to come in, and he really didn't know what the outcome was. But the bishop said, "You know, I have to admonish you." Paul said, "Okay." But I think that so the question about like how have I got to this moment? Because I really felt like, in my sense, my life has been preparing for the time for me to come to the Church of the Advocate, and I really believe that. I was never an activist before coming to the Advocate, but I always had dreams of becoming one. Right? But I was too busy raising kids and getting an education, right? Because I didn't get my doctorate until I was over 40 when I got my doctorate, my PhD. But you know what helped that in terms of my even getting to the place of getting my doctorate was that I thought that there was not value in my getting a PhD, right? Because I felt like I had to choose. I had to choose between doing the work, starting the activist work, or do I want to get an education? And do you remember Lonnie Guinier?
Yes.
Right. So around that time, she wrote a book, and she said, it started off the book, Ideas Matter. And so when I saw that was my personal liberation, right? Because ideas do matter. Somebody has to put the ideas into the world, right? And then other people can carry them forward if they're a good idea, right? So I prepared myself, and I feel blessed to be able to come to this moment. The other thing that's been interesting for me is that my dissertation was on the self-other relationship. And that's where I did this work on Emmanuel Levinas. Because I was really captivated by the idea that even before I'm consciously aware of it, I am called by God in responsibility for other people. Now, I'm not going to go as far as Levinas does and talk about subjectivity, but there's certainly that piece of responsibility that's there. Right? And what I have seen is that I have been able to live out that dissertation, those ideas, in my practice of ministry. And the Advocate is perfectly suited for that, or perhaps I'm perfectly suited for the Advocate. I don't know, but history will tell, right? Yeah. But I came to the Advocate, my question for the Advocate, what is the Advocate identity? Because it wasn't clear to me. And some of it is because the Advocate is a mission congregation. And we have uncritically received funds from the diocese in order for us to do the work that we have to do. So on one hand, we're preaching freedom and liberation and people making their own choices. And on the other hand, we're perfectly content to receive money, which is certainly not freedom, right? Somebody else has to pay our way. And so part of my larger mission is to be able to be at the Advocate long enough so that it becomes an independent congregation. Because then it practices what it preaches. But it's a hard uphill battle, I'll tell you the truth, right? But the Advocate knows about that.
Lina, Will.
What time are services on Sunday? Question, but what I want to ask now is, I'm just really stirred up. You've named that the trauma is systemic. And you're reweaving healing community in the midst of the trauma, but the systems of trauma are still there. What is the work your community can do in directly taking on those systems? And, what's the role of the churches in general? But I'd like to hear from that base, that community, what's your active resistance system to systemic oppression?
So for us it starts, so we're starting with healing, right? So we're saying that individuals in the community need to be healed. And then when strong individuals go back into the community, where they recognize that they can control their community, that they do have agency, then community transformation is possible. Right? Now I don't know if we will be able to tackle this whole system of white supremacy, but we certainly can tackle one community controlling its own destiny. Now if you know anything about what's going on in North Philadelphia, there is a battle going on between the community and Temple University about who has the right to use and change the space. All right? It's when we create a community that can stand up and fight Temple honestly, then we will have done what we intended to do. Yes.
Appreciate very much the very good work that your church is doing, that you are doing, and I'm especially happy to hear about your approach to systemic oppression, systemic violence, systemic racism. Would you be able to share with us some of the specific skills and knowledge that you are used in training members of your community?
Well, thank you. That's a good question. That's a fair question. But I will just say that, our healing project is just starting, right? But we have taken some concrete steps. The reason why we emphasize academic research, because not only do we recognize that that's a possible funding stream to get this work done. So honestly, that's part of it. But the other piece is that we want to be able to publish and to write about what's happening, right? So that there is a counter argument. So it means that we understand that there's something unique about how things are done in and among Black people. And that's just simply true. There's something unique about that. And it may challenge the normative way of doing research and understanding the impact of things. And so we're willing to do that. We want to do that. We want to create a different kind of conversation for a different kind of people, and we want that taken seriously. But one of the ways that we're doing, as I said, is we're partnering. The Advocate is all about partners. So you think about how I have 30 people who gather on Sunday morning for worship. Our sanctuary seats 1,000 people. That's only one of the problems, right? What we do it because of the strength of partners. So United Way, for example, is now one of our partners for the Healing Project. And so what they're going to do is to bring educational resources to the community. So they've already promised an investment of $10,000 in classes, in trauma-related classes, that they're going to make available to the Advocate community. That's how we utilize the strength of partners to make a difference. But the piece I really want to mention with that is, so even though we're out seeking funds and seeking partners, we stand firm in the truth that people cannot tell us how to do the work we're going to do. Right? Just because you've contributed some funds, it doesn't mean that you have any say or any control. Because I really believe that if God wanted this to happen, God will see that it happen. And we're just inviting you to take a forward stance, to take a progressive stance. And so we invite you to do that, but you cannot come in and tell us how to do what we're doing. Right? And I think that our new bishop is being made painfully aware of that. And even though I'm on his staff, the Advocate is my baby. Right? Claiming who you are.
Yeah, to add to that point, I'm Hasmin and I'm one of the organizers of the Sanctuary campaign, and just also like we want to lift up the place that the Church of the Advocate has in empowering community, empowering struggles led by effective community members. So stadium stompers are embraced or welcomed into the church. People with the Sanctuary Advocate Coalition are also welcomed into the church, and Reverend Renee has just created an amazing space where it's the affected people who are leading the struggle in this. And so I just also wanted to lift that up.
Thank you. You know, some of the most amazing times that I have at the Advocate is like on a Friday night. So there are Friday evenings because we have so much space. On a Friday evening recently, we have one of our artists in residence is a Prometheus Chamber Orchestra. They're playing in the sanctuary. Then we have a theater group called Kaleidoscope Cultural Arts, who is also artists in residence, and they have a play going, and this actually happens, they'll have a play going on in the auditorium in the Klein Theater. And then we might have something else. One night we had our after-school program, which falls under the umbrella of the Advocate Center for Culture and Education, and that's something that started under my ministry, which is a youth program. And so they'll have an open mic night on Friday. So all of these things are happening simultaneously. They all have their own community, right? Because you look at who comes to the orchestra, it's largely a white community who come to hear the orchestra. And then when there's a youth community that's coming to the Advocate on the mic, and there's a different community that gathers for plays. That is the beloved community. And we will know, for me, the real mark of success is when those communities intermingle. Not just see each other in passing, but even that's a powerful statement, right?
Yes.
Right? But to really find a way that they can intermingle. So the folks who come in for a meal, that's a different community. Cannot figure out how to get the people who come into a meal to come for the orchestra, or to come for a play, or to come for other things, right? But I suspect that if we open up the possibility of healing and we let folks know that all of this space is a space for all of us, no matter who you are, I think we may get to that place where we can all join together. We're really trying to figure out what it means for us to be the beloved community in North Philadelphia.
Hi, my name is Latira, she, her pronouns. I was curious about your kind of deliberate choice to move into a space of womanist theology, because I know there are options out there, but what was your deliberate, intentional choice around moving in this space, and how has that served you? How has that served your work?
Yeah. Well, I became aware of the fact that I was a black woman many years ago. And womanist theology spoke to me, right? I am, you know, what they say, the difference between a womanist and a feminist. On one hand, a womanist is a feminist of color, but it's more than that too, right? So what's important for womanist theology is that we recognize that we never just speak about the black women. Anytime we talk about black women for womanist theologians, we're also talking about the community. We are linked. I mean, so we cannot push women's issues separate from pushing issues that are concerning for the black community and black children. And I think that feminism might have a different take on something like that, nuanced slightly differently. Who is it that wrote the book, When and Where I Enter, the Whole Race Enters with Me,
Yes.
right? Black women never go any place by themselves. We're always accompanied by our men and our children. We're always concerned about the entire community. You know, when I was in seminary, we started reading Katie Cannon and Jacqueline Grant, some of the pioneers in womanist thinking, and it just resonated with me. It really did. And so it just shaped who I was. It shaped my theology, and it has shaped my practice of doing ministry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You spoke spoke briefly about the dynamic with Temple, and I was wondering, are you still a chaplain at Temple? What do you see as your role?
That's interesting.
Your role in the community and your role at the university?
So when I said that much of my life seemed to be led to this moment, I am also an alum of Temple. That's what right? Well, you know, and I think I was telling Camille, I said, I'm going to be an itch to Temple no matter what. Either I'll be an itch from the inside because I've made it a point of making sure the administration knows who I am and know that I am speaking in my understanding for the community and never on behalf of Temple, but I certainly can do that if Temple does the right thing. Or I will be on an itch from the outside, continually raising up the issues and the needs of the community, you know. The Temple's, you know, administration is administration. Power is the same, no matter what, right? And so I think that they might have been seduced in a false sense of who I am, thinking about Temple's administration, because they knew that I stood opposed to the stadium. I was with the group, the Stadium Stompers, I think when they formed, I was a part of that group. And so then I started becoming friendly with the administration, that was all good. And I think that they thought that somehow that because we were in a relationship, that I would either mute my voice or change my tone completely relative to the stadium. As much as I love Temple, my primary concern is not Temple University. God did not put me at the Advocate to serve Temple University. So my interaction with Temple is always about trying to create something at the Advocate that's useful for the community. Temple has resources, and I'm determined to get whatever resource I can. But I'm real clear, just like I said about the diocese, I'm not going to be controlled. Right? Paul Washington is not controlled.
That's right.
Ike Miller is not controlled. We answer to a higher authority, and that's the spirit of the Advocate. Yes.
So I'm trying to remember.
I have the mic, but since I have the mic, I'm gonna go ahead and ask my question. And this is maybe Camilla would be in a better position to answer this question, but the slide showing the effect of the trauma-affected brain, my question is does this have a permanent effect on the brain, or does healing actually manifest in a malleable?
It changes the brain, yes. As a person who has PTSD, a veteran, went through the whole treatment, still in treatment, will probably be dealing with it most of my life. It literally has an impact on the way that you not just see yourself, but process information that comes in. Yes.
That gives us hope for healing, but I'm aware of that epigenetic research that shows that what you mentioned about the change in DNA as well.
Yes.
So let us all be working to call to get
But
rid
it
of
also
white
says
supremacy.
there's some ways that we can respond to that. For instance, just sleeping. Like when we sleep and we go into REM state, that's a state where the things that happen in our natural world get to reconfigure itself in our dreams, and we get to solve it. So when we wake up, we feel like there's a sense of resolution to whatever that tension is that happened in the real world, whatever that trauma is. When you have PTSD and you have trauma like that, you don't get into REM sleep. So you're constantly falling and waking up. You're not in the process of dealing deep intentionally with what's going on. So you're constantly in a state of trauma and trigger. So these are just getting good sleep and having space just to even sleep is a way that we can actually just deal and kind of heal not just ourselves, but provide space for others to heal. So when we looked at that list that said homelessness, and you think about the community that's out there on the street, So you're constantly just being re-traumatized just in this narrative of being homeless. So it has this kind of systemic impact, but there's some things that if we, as a community, and this is why I love Renee and the advocate and why I'm committed to serving and being a part of the community, is if you create space for safety, like coming in and being able to sleep in the pew, you know, that's just a small way. But think if that ripple effect happened on a much larger magnitude, what we can do to just help each other heal. But those communities, particularly in North Philadelphia, that are dealing with systemic issues of trauma and poverty. So yes, it does change your brain from a personal narrative of my own, but also just through research, yes.
Thank you very much.
Joe?
Thank you. So I'm remembering meeting Father Washington when I was a teenager. And am I right that he was the first African-American Episcopal preacher?
At the Advocate. He was the first.
At the Advocate, okay. And I remember he made the news regularly. Seriously, and always inspirational. I'm so thankful that I knew him a little tiny bit.
Well, you know what's interesting? So Paul Washington was a pivotal figure at the Advocate, there's no question about it. But Paul found the Advocate, the Advocate was already doing some of the work that Paul did prior to its coming, right? So we think about the Church of the Advocate as you saw how elaborate the building is. Right? It was built as a memorial to George W. South by his wife and his daughter, out of his estate. And when they presented the deed to the Diocese of Pennsylvania to have the Advocate as a part of the diocese, the deed says that the church could not charge pew rents. So we have this incredible space, but there was never enough money to maintain the space because the Advocate was not built for wealthy people, as wonderful as it is. It was built for working class people. The family intentionally put the church at 18th and Diamond because industries were growing up in it, and they felt that there were unmet spiritual needs, and so they put the Advocate in that space. So from the beginning, the Advocate has faced a lot of challenges, but it always had a strong social service component, even before Paul Washington came. So I say that there is a spirit of the Advocate, right? And always say that Paul was privileged because he was able to live out his ministry at the Advocate, right? The Advocate is the Advocate. And I think that whoever comes to the Advocate, it's going to shape you so that you're the kind of person the Advocate needs. If you walk into this space, it really feels like holy space. It really does. But it's interesting because, and I do believe in spirits, obviously, and I certainly recognize the presence of the ancestors. So we have all these 14 murals that represent real people in the African community, our ancestors. We have the George W. South family, wealthy people, buried in the crypt of the Advocate, right? One of the last things Paul Washington did before he retired was to bury a black woman in the crypt of the Advocate. So at least now the crypt is integrated. But then you have to match that with people come to the Advocate carrying tremendous burdens and doing tremendous work. And I know that when you come into a space like that, you leave a little bit of yourself when you leave in that space. And so there's this presence of you're all spiritual people, so you understand. I mean, there is this presence of the Spirit that is real and palpable. And when I first got there, it greeted me with confusion. I walked into that space and it was the loudest space I had ever been in, right? Spiritually loud, because it was unsettled. It was unsettled. And I say it was a clash of cultures. We got these rich people fighting with the ancestors of the black folks, and there was just a clash of cultures going on, right? And so my tradition, you know, in the Episcopal Church, we hang a sanctuary light. We keep reserved sacraments there, the blessed body and blood of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. There was no reserved sacrament in the building when I came to the Advocate. And so I said, well, one of the first things I had to do, we got to put that side. Jesus Christ has come here and settle this stuff down. And then, of course, I called some of my praying African brothers and sisters. I said, come in and let's pray this place. And we did that. And then over time, one day I walked in and it was silent. It was silent. But there is still a spirit that walks around, I'll be honest with you. There is a spirit in the Advocate. It's an old building.
I love the power of the murals. What they communicate, the generative, ongoing creative voices, I'm sure, and in your response to them, no bullshit in the midst of the ancestors. What does it mean to minister in the gaze of the ever-present eyes of the oppressor from everyone?
Listen, I'm part of the Episcopal Church, and that's kind of funny to me, right? Because the Episcopal Church is a white denomination. It's a wealthy white denomination. I remember when I was teaching, when I was in the getting my PhD, and I taught a course on the history and theology of the Black Church. And every time I got to the section about the Episcopal Church, I would laugh. I was not Episcopal at this time, right? Because in my mind, why would a Black person want to be part of a white denomination if you have a choice? Right? We already know that how religion is practiced. It is the religion of the empire, right? As we said earlier. And so I used to get a chuckle about hearing about Black Episcopalians. Like, why? Until I was Baptist, right? Until I started to pay attention to what the Episcopal Church was willing to do, but other denominations were not willing. They were willing to put money in the game for rights, for justice. They were willing to put their bodies on the line, right? And I said, okay, so maybe this is where I should go because I know I can get a pension. I can work full-time as a priest. I don't have to have a part-time job. Right? But more than that, I will be in an environment where people understood what it meant to try to do justice. Now, the Episcopal Church doesn't get it right all the time. We know that nobody does. But at least they're willing to do it. So yeah, the eyes of the oppressor, I just accept that as fact, right? I mean, I'm a Black woman who grew up in America. I mean, I'm surrounded by white people. I live in a system of white supremacy, and yeah.
Questions have been really good, so I'm just gonna ask a really easy one, get out of the way. What is pew rent?
Oh, pew rent. So pew rent is just when the more money you pay, the better location of the pew you get to sit in. It's your family pew, nobody else gets to sit there. I mean, you paid for it, it's yours, and it's your reserved space. And so that's how the church used to primarily finance itself, by charging pew rents. And so the fact that the church was forever deemed pew rent free meant that they expected to attract people who could not be able to pay for the pews.
Thank you.
Not the white churches.
And synagogues.
At the church I serve in Baltimore, we have a free community meal that we provide once a week. And our vision and our hope is that it's a community meal where everybody's coming together to gather around a common table and share the food and participate in the sharing. But we find in practice that ultimately we have power, that we have food that we're giving to people who don't have food, and there's a power relationship there. Not to mention all the other power and privilege that we might have over the folks that come for a meal like that. in the meal that you offer and in all the ministry you offer. I mean, part of healing, I think, is passing the healing you've received on to the next person. So how do you cross that line from being in a power relationship to being in a relationship of equality with the people you're serving?
That's a good question. So one of the things that, when I went to the Advocate, I mean, they were the long rectangular tables, you know, and so people used to come in, we would sit down and then we would plate, we would put food on the plate and we would bring it to you. We thought that we were doing an act of justice by serving people. But actually we were taking away people's agency because they should be able to come up and decide what they want on their plate. So we changed it. So we got round tables, and round tables are a better way for people to have conversation. And we started playing music in the background. People started talking about, I'm bringing my date to the Advocate. I mean, so we really started to create a community in a different way than it had been before. And the other thing that we did, I'm real intentional about hiring people from the community as much as I can. And so our cooks all come from the community. Our outreach coordinator, we try to make all of these people come from the community. Not because, you know, at Temple always complain about the gatekeepers, right? So at Temple, all the gatekeepers are black while the administration is white. So the people you're coming in contact with are the gatekeepers. You're coming in contact with black folks. But remember that some of the, what do they call who used to manage the slaves, like they were also slaves anyway, so you have to be careful about that. But at the Advocate, it really is a community affair. It's a community event. And so that power dynamic remains, right? So even among people who from the community, but they're in a position of relative power because they determine who get to have food on their plate, all those kinds of decisions. So I'm always talking about my staff about what it means to even have power in this sense, right? And how do you treat people? How do you try to have a kind of relationship that is about equity? Right? So that's a conversation that's an ongoing conversation. One of the things that we had, someone from the American Muslim from Hunger Relief, they came and visited us, and so every Friday they provide halal meals. So we do offer halal meals on Friday.
Nice.
And we encourage our Muslim brothers and sisters to come in and have a meal. We want to make the table as inclusive as possible, right? We say the God who love community does not just represent black people. I mean, it represents all of us. And that's why the relationship that we have now with Carmela and the Sanctuary Advocate Coalition, right? So multi-faith, various ethnicities, but the idea is that we're all in the position of facing oppression, resisting. Yeah. Many hands make light work. Well, thank you very much for entertaining.